2.
Welcome. I'm Debbie Viadero, and I'm one of the assistant managing editors here at Education Week. This is the part of the program where we recap some of the discussions that have been going on in our chat rooms for the last hour and a half. And with me are three of the reporters who organized and led those discussions. On my far right is Stephen Sawchuk, whose chat room focused on reading instruction in career technical education programs. Next to him is Allison Klein, who talked about assessment of workplace skills in states across the country. And Sarah Sparks, whose discussion focused on writing instruction and professional writing skills. I'm going to start off by asking each of you to tell me a bit about what the talk was like in your room. Sarah?
So we had a lot of really good practical discussion of what writing skills are professional and how is that different from just teaching students good writing skills. It seems as though the biggest difference is professional writing is writing for a specific audience and being mindful of tone and an ongoing relationship in ways that students might not have when they're just writing a book report or a 5-paragraph essay.
Thanks. Allison, go ahead.
So we had a really in-depth discussion in our room. There's a lot of question about what it actually means to be college and career ready, and whether that's just reading and math, or whether that should include some social emotional skills, and then how those should be measured. There was also some chatter about exactly how you design some sort of a measurement or gauge for all the different types of careers that are out there, and how that can be a really tricky puzzle for states.
Thanks. Sounds interesting. Steve?
Well, I just had the best panelists and the best people attending, and they were sharing a lot of tips and strategies, which in a way I think is very telling, right? Because when we think literacy, I think we tend to think of it very much within the academic disciplines rather than CTE, which is an applied discipline. And I also think we tend to think earlier grades, right? Rather than what students at the high school level are thinking about. And so it was wonderful to see people sharing so many different ideas, engaging with research, giving really clear, concrete examples. I mean, it was a really substantive discussion.
It's good to hear. Sarah, a question for you. How has social media affected professional writing?
That came up
Badly.
Yes. There were several teachers and people who are in different disciplines who were talking about the problems and challenges that have been caused by students growing up texting and tweeting instead of even writing emails. It was astonishing how many folks had seen their classes have no writing, casual writing, letter writing, while they were growing up. And that makes it a lot more important for students to get those skills formally in school because they're less likely to be writing letters to grandma or writing letters for an internship on their own without the school support.
Okay, and Steve, for you, I'm wondering about CTE teachers. How do you get them on board with literacy instruction, since a lot of them probably didn't get a lot of training in literacy?
This to me was the most interesting part of our whole entire discussion, right? So often you hear students who are in CTE programs saying, well, why do I need to, I got into this because I want to fix cars, or I want to, go into allied health or something like that. And it's interesting, I'd never really thought of this before, but you have a very similar reaction from CTE teachers who love their field, love the content, love their machines, and whatever else. That's why they got into it. They're really content experts. And I think often there's a little bit of like, well, I'm not trained to teach literacy. Maybe I don't necessarily want to lead literacy. So there is sort of a hurdle here that I think we often don't think about. So Travis, who's one of our panelists, talked about the work he's done in New York with some of the regional centers there. And he said it takes up to 7 days of professional development, which is a luxury, to get an entire CTE staff on board with this. And a lot of that is developing, really, I think, developing like a shared definition and vision for what literacy instruction in these fields looks like. We had one of the commentators one of the educators who came to the panel said, you can start off by talking about something like Tier 2 vocabulary, words that cross disciplines and why those are important words for students to be able to know to help sort of start generating that collective vision. And Travis actually had this great example too of like sometimes we don't even think of terms in CTE as being literacy when they are. So he gave the example of an E660, I'm going to get this wrong, but E6013 welding rod, which, to your average CTE, like, somebody in a welding program, that's just, like a rod, but like all of those letters stand for something, right? So E is electrode, 60 is the tensile strength of the weld, the chemical makeup of the flux, right? So right there you have this word that means something that you can break down into, vocabulary like electrode and tensile strength. And there's just really rich opportunities here that I think sometimes we don't think about because these are really content experts. So I just thought that was really, really fascinating. I think it's doable, but I think it requires some difficult kind of conversations about what PD support these teachers need. And of course, often with literacy, we do reading coaches. Well, that's, first, second, third, fourth grade. It's very rarely in the secondary levels and very rarely specifically for CTE teachers. So that was like another thing I was thinking about is, maybe we have these resources and we're not deploying them in the right places.
Mm-hmm. Allison, you mentioned college and career readiness and a lot of the discussion around that. How does the movement to hold states accountable for college and career readiness affected the teaching of that?
So that's a great question. I think the answer is still the jury's still out on that. Folks should know that as part of the Every Student Succeeds Act, states had to pick some sort of measure of school quality or student success to hold their schools accountable for. So it becomes part of the school grade. And many of them, I would say the vast majority of states, went with college and career readiness. And one of my guests was pointing to an example of a state, and my guest Ryan Rayner was not specific about which state, that had certain metrics in place, and so because of these having to get some sort of a credential, a lot of the students went for like credentialing in Microsoft Office, which is not maybe the most rigorous credential, sending email. I'm sure it's a little more complicated than that you could go after. So sometimes accountability can kind of get in the way. Holding schools accountable for these measures can kind of get in the way of doing the best job possible of getting students to actually become college and career ready.
Sarah, in your discussion, was there talk about where the greatest need is in terms of writing instruction? Are we talking about general writing skills to be the need or more discipline-specific writing?
Well, there were interesting discussions around that. It seems as though the greatest need is in some very basic professional skills, writing emails, writing formal memos in which you're summarizing different sets of data as well as different colleagues' interpretations of that. There's very little collaborative writing in schools, even when they're doing project-based learning, and that's something that's really common in the workplace. So there were things that cut across disciplines. Steve Graham, who was one of our panelists, also spoke a little bit about the differences in context and discipline and how that affected students' content knowledge and how the content knowledge affected students' writing. So, for example, a police officer writing up a crime scene report will have a very different tone and a different audience and need to focus on how they're presenting the content in very different ways than someone who's, say, a psychology professor and is writing a journal article. And so that sort of discussion about how students' disciplines and students' career interests should shape how they write, that kind of came up in some of this discussion.
I sense in writing a movement away from the long college-level research papers that people once did. Is that really happening, and is that reflective at all of of the move toward professional writing?
We heard a little bit of both. There was some discussion around whether there's pushback from the community if people start trying to push professional writing as opposed to literature or book reports and academic writing. And it seems that the Common Core has presented a lot more opportunities and requirements for text-based writing and more informational writing. And professional writing often falls into that category. It also seems as though some of these skills are so basic that it really doesn't take out the basic types of academic writing. It just shows the need for basic adult writing.
In career technical education in particular, I would think that probably the need is to find text sets that are aligned with specific careers. Is that easy to do? And what are teachers doing?
No, it's not. And I kept thinking, during the course of this panel, there's got to be some tech startup somewhere that's like, gonna make a mint if they crack this nut, right? Like, because, with Common Core, and I think, especially with the conversation about building background knowledge, right? You have a lot of people that are putting together really rich tech sets. I mean, Allison, you know this, of course. Louisiana is working on this as part of its testing system. And, but I think we haven't seen nearly as much of that with CTE. And the challenge is that it's not just, pairing fiction and nonfiction. It's also the technical element, right? And sometimes finding the appropriate reading there. You can find it in a manual, you can find it sometimes in textbooks, but not all of these CTE fields have like a core text. And so a lot of the teachers are really sort of creating their own, lists of articles that they use. And I talked to one gentleman who literally had an RSS feed, for anything criminal justice related for that career cluster, because the main thing that he could find was case law and, case summaries. And you can really only give kids like enough of, a few of those before you really need something else. And then, but, as Sarah said, right, like if you're in law enforcement or anything in the justice system, you do a lot of writing, reports and memos and logs. And so, sometimes I think we don't even think about the fact that a lot of these careers are actually quite heavily reading and writing dependent. So
it's interesting. Several folks came in and were asking questions about how students with special needs were being supported in these kind of writing classes. And it was really interesting that it seemed having these more practical writing skills being taught that were catering to what they were interested in doing with their lives, it helped engagement, and it seemed to help them organize what they were writing and thinking about.
I think also, sometimes this is framed very much as a, literature versus, nonfiction versus a fiction divide, right? Like that maybe CTE students or people that are really career-focused don't need, literature. But there's a lot of like literary nonfiction that's beautifully crafted, right? That you can draw from.
Journalism.
Journalism. Yeah, somebody said they were using an Ed Week article, and I was
so cool.
super excited.
Yeah, that's
But Larissa, who is one of my panelists, and she works with a great CT center in Michigan. So she gave the example in the health program, they use basically like essays written by nurses, like nonfiction, really lovely memoirs, not the right word, but you know what I mean, like sort of like a chronicle of their experiences as a nurse. Journals, exactly. Yeah. You know what I mean? And when she was saying this, and yes, I'm a bit of a of a literature geek myself, I was thinking about, there's a really long historical tradition of those kinds of narratives, right? Like, so Vera Brittain writes this in England during World War I, right? And so it's like there's there are a lot of really rich connections you can make to history and other disciplines, even in these core CT areas. And I think we don't think about how to do that. So I just really hope that, from this discussion, somebody out there listening will think, oh, like this is a great opportunity to provide a service a lot of teachers could use.
Allison, in assessing these kinds of skills, what was the discussion around work keys? Are many states using that test, and how is it working out?
So only a small number of states, as Steve wrote in a story actually about this. I believe, what is it, 4 states, Steve?
About four
states,
yeah.
are using work keys as the assessment. So many states are using actually the military readiness assessment. More of them, at least, have incorporated that assessment into their ASA plans. Yeah, ASVAD. Thank you, Sarah. Then they have the work keys, which I'm hearing haven't been updated, in quite a while. So there aren't so many kind of off-the-shelf, out-of-the-box tests that states can use at this point to assess workplace skills.
Do either of you know if things like writing and reading are assessed through work keys, or is it more of the social emotional kinds of skills, or?
Let me see. There's reading for information. I'm probably getting some of the names of this right. There's one about locating and using data. So that's a lot of interacting with graphic representations.
I believe ASVAB has some writing and has some informational, at least summary tasks.
But one of the things that I think is interesting is that the content domain that work keys and some of these other exams seems to test is sort of narrower than what we would think of as a general reading or writing test. So Sarah knows this, that when the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is of course the nation's report card, comes out every so often. I mean, they were trying to figure out if there was if they could use the scores on their academic tests to give you some sort of measure of how ready you were for the workplace, and they actually kind of concluded there was not enough overlap, and they could not make those determinations. And I don't know how many states have looked at that, but I think that is a challenge for states that sort of want to get these career measures.
Well, and certainly, I mean, if you look at the tasks for the National Association. NAEP.
Just call it NAEP, Sarah.
The nation's report card.
Yeah.
They aren't asking kids to do a whole lot of professional writing tasks. In fact, there have been studies of the kinds of tasks that students are doing in school as compared to what they're doing in the workplace once they get out of school. And you really, even in fairly comprehensive tests, you're still working with a short essay, and by short I mean maybe a couple of paragraphs, or summarizing, but still in fairly condensed ways, because that's the easiest ways for the very long grading and scoring to take place. And so some of these more complex tasks about understanding an array of data and combining it and managing a relationship across several interactions in email or in memos, those sorts of things are just really difficult to test.
Sarah, one thing I wondered about in teaching writing, are teachers making use of technology-based tools, and do they see them as a help or a crutch for students?
Well, when we first printed the special report on workplace literacy, there were a number of comments about, we really need to get back to basics. Students don't understand grammar. We can't focus on professional writing and letter writing when kids don't understand basic grammar and sentence structure. And what we heard a lot in this discussion is teachers are already using a lot of tools well beyond like the basic cut and paste and spell check, but things like Grammarly, which is I think an open source grammar tool. Some are using tools originally designed for catching plagiarism, like Violet, I believe it's called. that they're, instead of using them as a gotcha for their students turning in term papers, they're teaching them how to use those tools to submit their own writing and revise it based on understanding, oh, you're not citing this correctly. Oh, this is a really common phrasing and you can phrase it better. And so there was a great openness to exploring technology-based tools that adults just typically use. And so it seems as though while they're still teaching rewrite and reading over your own pieces over and over, they're also acknowledging that as adults, students are going to grow up using these technology tools the same way everybody basically uses spell check now.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to interject here to tell viewers that this whole session was built off of a special report we did earlier this year called Literacy for the Workplace. And so I just want to refer you to the report if you want to read more in depth about some of the things that we've been talking about today. You can go to www.edweek.org/go/literacy for work, all one word. I hope you'll do that. Do we have time for any more questions? We have 5 minutes, so I would like each of you or to talk a little bit about the stories that you did for the special report. Sarah, yours was also on writing.
Yes, mine was specifically on professional writing. And I talked to a number of teachers, including Tony Nasavera, who was one of our guests today, who was a high school economics and history teacher who got into doing more business writing and developed his own course for teaching students business writing. And it was all coming from seeing their tone in emails to him, the way they were thinking about applying for jobs, and really seeing that students needed to do more to understand the tone and audience and formal style that they were using in communications as people entering the workforce. So it's been really interesting talking with teachers about how they are integrating professional writing, not just in English classes, and not just in creating a business course, but across the curriculum.
So I have to confess, I did not do a story for the special report, although it was a fun read. But I did do a story earlier this year on how states are incorporating college and career readiness into their ESSA plans and how it looks absolutely different in every single state. There's no single definition of college and career readiness. A few states are choosing just kind of 2 or 3 ways that you could demonstrate that. For instance, by success on the SAT or ACT or AP courses, maybe earning a certification. Some states have like 7 to 9 measures of different pathways for showing that you're college and career ready. And one big concern of folks in the civil rights community is that not all states are showing how poor students and students of color are doing relative to their peers and which of these pathways they're taking. So that's something to really watch for in policy going forward.
That's a good point. Steve, you did a couple stories, so you can pick your favorite.
Yeah, well, I think the one that I learned the most from was the one that I read about reading in a current technical education context. And, I think it's become sort of common, right, that people say you have to read across the content areas. Obviously this was something that Common Core and a lot of other English language arts standards have pushed over the years. But, I think often we left CTE out of that equation. And it's curious when you look at data from employers, because one of the things they're often saying is, I need people who can synthesize and analyze across, a variety of sources of information, which really means that you need to be able to read and juxtapose and make sense of a variety of different texts, right? So this is a reading, in a lot of ways, this is a reading exercise. And of course, we don't ever tend to think of reading within a CTE context. So that story explores some of the research about this, because we've actually known for a long time that adults tend to improve in literacy when they're taught not general literacy, but within the context of a task that they're going to do. This comes out of military research from like the 1970s, right? So it's fairly fairly well established at this point, and yet curiously that hasn't quite worked its way into our secondary CTE programs. I also profiled the center, and Larissa, one of my panelists today, is one of the teachers there, where they put a real emphasis on in each of their career fields having a literacy program and giving students a credit in ELA that goes towards the state's graduation requirements, and that was a great illustration of the principle in action.
Okay. Well, we could go on and on, I think, but we won't. That's all we have time for today. Thank you for joining us.